Hey everybody. I'm going to be talking about the narrative policy framework. So let me see if I can share my screen. Share, present. Okay. So the narrative policy framework focuses on framing the narratives or stories of the different policy issues. So the key question that it addresses is, do the narratives play an important role in the policy process? So it's kind of like, can narratives influence how policy decisions are made, or can they influence the way people are thinking about a specific topic? So as a little bit of background info, the framework was officially named in 2010. The work began on it in 1999 when the first edition of Sabatier's Theories of Policy Process, that's our textbook, was published. So this framework just kind of incorporates studies in a ton of different fields like communication, psychology, marketing, political science, all kinds of things. And it pretty much just tries to create a story that appeals to human interests. And then it can like market that story to the public to try to gain support for it. So it can then affect how the narrative like changes the design or the process or decisions of policy. So then narratives are described by their content and form, and content is just kind of like the story or what's being talked about, while form is the structure that's used to present it. And then there are different specific narrative elements that can be found in all different kinds of policies, and each story doesn't have a completely unique structure. Like once these elements are named and defined, these items can be dissected and compared to other policies, and you can kind of find the same elements among different types of stories, and then you can see which of those elements can influence people the most. And so narratives can just be important for policy success and political longevity because they draw people in and they keep support on their side of the policy argument. So policy advocacy just kind of relies on large groups of people that want the same decision, and then people form their opinions and come to those decisions when stories appeal to their emotions or values. So talking about the core elements, there are four basic ones. The first one is setting, which is kind of the legal and constitutional parameters or the geography, scientific evidence, economic conditions, social norms, things like that. And these can be the focal point of the narrative, or they can just be kind of a background place that the narrative, like that the characters are taking place in. The characters are, there needs to be at least one, and they can be victims that are harmed, villains who do the harm, heroes who provide or promise relief from that harm, and then heroes who kind of find a solution to the problem. And then plot is the relationships between characters, establishing them in that setting. There's usually an arc of action that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then the last core element is the moral that promotes a policy solution. So the solution is kind of the moral of the story at the end. And these four elements are just kind of found through all different narratives. So then there's always assumptions that have to be made in any framework. And then if these are proven false, then there's an issue with that approach. So for this specific framework, they are social construction, where variable meanings that groups assign to various objects or processes associated with public policy. So there's just, it's kind of like what we talked about with the last time we met in class. I don't know how many weeks ago that was. It feels like forever. Where there's just kind of different meanings that groups assign to different groups. So like people just view groups a certain way and kind of create a vision for that social group in their heads. And then there's bounded relativity, where those constructions can vary, but then that variation is bounded by belief systems, ideologies, norms, and things like that. And then there's generalizable structural elements, so specific structures that are like the plot or the characters can be in multiple different contexts. So just kind of they're generalizable among different types of stories instead of like each story being completely unique. You can find these things across different stories. And then there's simultaneous operation at 3 levels, which I'll talk more about this in depth on the next slide. So we'll get to that then. And then the last one is model of the individual. So the narrative plays a central role in how information is processed, and then that determines how it's communicated and reasoned. So those are the assumptions. So the 3 levels of analysis is kind of like the main portion of this topic. And so those 3 levels are micro, meso, and macro. And these are just referring to the people targeted by the narrative. And then they go up in terms of size. So like micro is at the individual level, meso is in the middle, it focuses on coalitions and groups, and then macro is the largest, kind of at a cultural and institutional level. So to get into them, I know Alejandra is going to talk kind of a lot about the micro section, and mine is going to kind of focus on meso and macro. But just to give you kind of a baseline of all of these different terms, micro, it also goes by Homo neurans. I think that's how that's pronounced. And it just has a lot of different terms that describe how individuals function and form their opinions. So the first one is bounded rationality, where individuals can make decisions with limited time and information, and then they'll just settle for an acceptable alternative. And then the heuristics is where people kind of rely on information shortcuts to process info and to facilitate that decision making. So that can be rooted in past experience, training, biases that we all have, and things like that. The primary of affect is where emotions play a role in focusing human attention. That kind of highlights what's important and sets priorities. So emotions come before reason when kind of like that focused attention. 2 kinds of cognition is just where unconscious automatic thought processes, like we're each born with those kind of automatic ones, and they can also be learned through practice, and that's considered system 1. And most of our kind of daily thinking is handled by system 1, unless there's something that is kind of harder, and then we can activate our system 2. And system 2 is usually in conservation mode until it's called upon to handle more, and then system 2 can only do one task at a time. So hot cognition is if something's unfamiliar, we'll kind of search through our minds to assign that new concept in terms of our existing understanding. Confirmation bias is where we treat evidence that agrees with our opinions as stronger than evidence that disagrees. So we kind of process the stimuli that agrees with what we're thinking faster than something that's different. Selective exposure is when select sources and information that's congruent with what they already believe. So like if you watch your preferred news channel, you're kind of choosing what information you're taking in. So it's selective. And then identity protective cognition, it's kind of where selective exposure, confirmation bias, and different tools like that are used to protect a prior identity and who the person understands themselves to be already. And then primacy of groups and networks is kind of the social, professional, family, cultural networks and groups, how those people influence how information's processed. So kind of look to our trusted relationships just to make sense of the world around us. And then the last one is narrative cognition, where narrative is just the primary way to make sense of and to situate yourself into the world. So overall, the focus for micro is just things like, as a perception of agreement increases, individuals are more likely to be persuaded by the narrative that they're hearing. Or as a narrator, like as trust in that narrator increases, then an individual is more likely to be persuaded to agree with that policy opinion. And so just the way characters are portrayed kind of influence citizens and officials and elites more than just any scientific or technical information that can be given. So that's micro, and then we can move on to meso, where meso, so it also goes by agora neurans, and that just kind of is the groups and coalitions of the policy narratives. So any coalitions that are competing could have different preferences that are expressed as narratives. Like one coalition could think of the federal government as a hero, while another would think of private industries as heroes. And so the ultimate goal is just to try to kind of gain people with similar policy preferences or convince people to agree in order to achieve kind of the favorable policy output. So while an individual system could be something like climate change in one state, a meso-level approach would be to compare climate change in all 50 states, since those narratives are likely to kind of cross multiple subsystems and be similar across those different states. So just looking at kind of this meso level helps to understand the policy process more because you're looking at a broader group. So there are kind of four main topics in the meso. The first one is scope of conflict, where interest groups construct narratives that can expand or contain policy issues. So like if a group loses, they try to expand the conflict and make it a bigger deal and kind of get people to talk about it more and try to win people over to their side. Whereas the group that wins the conflict, they kind of try to contain the issue so that it stays the status quo. So they want to make it seem like it's not that big of an issue. This is just kind of the new normal. And then causal mechanisms is the responsibility and blame for the policy problem. So kind of explanations of why one factor leads to another in a policy development, like how income disparities or lack of education then lead to political unrest or something like that. And then the devil and angel shift, which this will come up again kind of later when we talk about the article, but it predicts how the actors can exaggerate the malicious motives or behaviors and influence of opponents. So like heroes are fixers while villains are problem investigators. And so in the devil shift, there's going to be a higher ratio of villains versus heroes, where they're looking to kind of put blame and not identify the heroes that could fix the problems. And then the angel shift is the opposite, where there's going to be a higher ratio of heroes to villains. So a devil shift is kind of like more evil, more villains, and then angel shift is kind of focusing on the heroes, the good things. And then the last one is coordination and learning. So we talked about a lot of this with the advocacy coalition framework, where you just kind of like shared beliefs are the glue that holds those coalitions together. So these shared beliefs can then measure the strength, their stability, or cohesion of a group. So the coordination between all the members of the group is important to achieve results. And that policy learning can take place between those groups and coalitions, like changes in the narrative story that we're talking about can be a prompt for that learning. So just overall, the meso kind of talks about how groups who lose will use narratives to expand policy issues and increase their coalition size. And then groups who win will use narratives to contain a policy issue as the status quo. And the coalitions that have more of that glue that holds them together will be more likely to influence outcomes. So then the last one is macro, which is the cultural and institutional groupings. These kind of have the least amount of research on them, but they are just the communal and historical narratives that can explain human events across time and place. So they're more stable over time, but they can still change slowly as culture shifts. And like an example of something that's macro would be how consumerism has influenced people's opinions and their way of viewing the world. So people that are policy marketers can sell public opinion, where they're kind of the ones who are defining what the problems are, and the actual citizens aren't defining what the issues are. It's these people that are kind of like pushing out the information that are deciding what they want people to care about, and then as people see it, they're going to care about those issues. And so that marketer is the link between the macro and the meso section, and then micro comes in because it's relevant in how the narrative shapes like that individual opinion. So then, just to kind of go over the main points that you should remember from this framework, so the connections between those three levels are like constantly being made, and they're going to benefit the overall study of the framework. So there's just continuing research that's going on with how those three levels are connected. And then the framework, it is empirical, but it's kind of more of a qualitative framework since it uses things like interviews and focus groups and participant observation to determine the different parts, like the different elements that are in each narrative. And then just kind of the main point of the narrative is that it influences the design of policy, the process of designing it, and then the outcomes that are decided upon because of the narratives told about each option. And so an example of that would just be like the Mexico and US border is a policy dispute. So it's a geographic border, but it's also a policy construction. So it just kind of studies how interest groups or officials or the media can kind of create their narrative around the border. And depending on who's telling the story, it could be a focus on economic trade or shared public health problems or a war zone from the drug trade. Like each of these different stories has different heroes, villains, victims, and the solutions that they kind of decide on will be different based on their point of view. So someone could think that the solution is increased trade if you're focusing on the economic portion, or it could be on kind of a collaborative health initiative if it's public health, or drug intervention if it's the drug trade. So that's just going to kind of differ. So that's the main part of the framework. The article that I talked about it was written by Melissa Mary, and it kind of applies the framework to gun policy. So it was a content analysis of about 10,000 tweets between the years of 2009 to 2014 to see how social media was integral in policy. And it just kind of frames it ends up framing like why people believe mass shootings occurred, how groups can build alliances and mobilize their supporters, and how the problem is then remedied since the definition of the problem affects those solutions. And so it just kind of answers three main questions. It's to what extent do gun policy groups use Twitter to construct their narratives? How do those elements in the gun policy groups' tweets vary over time? And then do gun policy groups' tweets evidence specific narrative strategies? So like this time period included several mass shootings like Tucson, Arizona, the movie theater shooting in Aurora, Colorado, Sandy Hook in Newtown, and just like a bunch of different stuff happened in this time. So they're kind of analyzing tweets to see what the stories were told by two different groups during that time. And so it's broken down into two interest groups, the NRA and then the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. So the issue of gun control is really polarizing, where people are constantly arguing about gun reform to reduce crime, while others kind of think that that's too controlling, and they want to emphasize the individual's rights to own guns for self-defense. So for the Brady campaign, the public and the gun control advocates are going to be the heroes of the story, while the NRA kind of talks about the lack of security in schools and the need for increased police presence. So they're kind of saying, like, maybe the police are the heroes of that story, or the good guy with the gun, or something like that. And then the Brady campaign also focuses on mass shootings and the victims, while the NRA kind of focuses on self-defense shootings. So both are using particular elements of the narrative to benefit their policy choices. Like both are ignoring the fact that a lot of gun-related deaths are because of suicide, because that's not kind of helping their narrative. They're focusing on what's going to help their agenda and get their policy issues passed. And then, okay, so staying on the slide. So they looked through different tweets to find if there is the presence or absence of certain narrative elements. So these are kind of all the different things that they looked for. There was allies, events, evidence, hero, villain, victim, opponent, and solution. So kind of after the Sandy Hook shooting, the NRA was kind of quiet about the issue because they tend to avoid they kind of want to avoid talking about mass shootings because that's not going to help kind of their policy agenda. But then on the other side, the Brady campaign is going to tweet a lot after these mass shootings occur because their focus is going to be on victims and the heroes of the story. And so the Brady campaign's tweets, they usually contain like the event, a victim, a villain, a hero, and a solution. And then the NRA's tweets kind of like allude to, but they don't specifically mention a shooting. And the organization didn't mention victims really. But they did still contain like their version of allies or an opponent or a villain, and then they still offered solutions. So like at the total level, the organization's tweets connect that shooting to a set of policy alternatives that they're trying to get passed. And then the amount of characters in one tweet is only 140. So like when you look at a single tweet, the narrative is going to be less obvious than when you say like, okay, let's look at all the tweets that happened in 1 week versus, or all the tweets that happened in 1 day. So when you look at that whole thing, it can be easier to kind of pull out these narrative pieces. Whereas when you're looking at just like your simplified 140 character tweet, you might have 1 or 2 elements, but it can't be a whole story just because that character limit is limited. So on this graph, it's just kind of the results of that study. So it shows how the 2 different groups used elements within those narratives. So they focus a lot on solutions, but those solutions are going to be different since they both define that problem differently. And then also the Brady campaign talks a lot more about victims and the event than the NRA. And then the NRA kind of talks more about their opponent. Both groups used slightly more heroes than villains, which shows an absence of that devil shift that we talked about earlier. So there's actually a slight angel shift where they kind of focus on talking about heroes more than villains. And shifting that focus to heroes more than villains in the policy is potentially associated with more positive outcomes for that group. Like they're more likely to get their policy passed. Even though there still needs to be more research on it, that's kind of something that they've noticed happen. So overall, it's just kind of about creating a story and getting people to kind of emotionally buy into that story. And like if people relate to those characters more, they're going to be more likely to agree with you. And then the gun policy example is just an example of that. So I think we're going to end up posting some questions on the discussion board. And I guess I don't know how to end this. It seems kind of weird, but I hope everyone's doing well, staying safe. Bye.